Hello and welcome. My name is Twyla Dang, and you are listening to Beyond Me Too, Turning Our Collective Voice into Action. Before we start today's discussion, we just want to make sure that we acknowledge that the information you're going to hear in this podcast may be difficult to listen to. It may be triggering for some listeners, and it may be topics that are difficult sort of to process. So we encourage you, if that is something that is a problem for you or something that you may find challenging, that please use your own standard for self-care in approaching and listening to this podcast. Today, we're going to be having a discussion around the issues that came out of the Me Too hashtag and the collective call to action that we see growing in our collective community of women surrounding issues of sexual assault, sexual violence, survivorship, and taking all of these things and turning them into positive action. Joining me today for the discussion is Sarah Stamsher. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and Sarah Super, who is the founder of the Break the Silence movement. Thank you both ladies for coming in today.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
Now, as a part of this, I think if you've come to this podcast and you're listening to it, I think you already have a bit of a background of what's been going on. You know a little bit about I think the easiest way to phrase it is, we've seen recently in the media that Harvey Weinstein is at the epicenter of a gigantic scandal that only seems to be growing in scope and scale. It is now starting to blow back in other industries, and it is really bringing up not only issues with women of personal stories, personal feelings and emotions of things that we've been through as individuals, but also sort of acknowledging that we have this entire sort of institutional system that is broken that allows for women and vulnerable people to be preyed on. But first, I want to acknowledge that Me Too as a hashtag and as a movement, it gained a lot of traction because it was such a perfectly simple way to acknowledge that you were a part of what sort of had gone on. So I'm not sure. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the idea of what it kind of brought out in people?
Well, what I'm seeing is that, and what I've experienced just myself outside of being a marriage and family therapist, is that most vulnerable people, women, people of color, people that identify as LGBTQIA, they experience things and they have to keep quiet about it. And so when you start to see Me Too here, Me Too there, it's all of a sudden like, wait a minute, I'm not alone. I can maybe do this one simple step to just step out of the comfort zone to see what would happen. Wait a minute, I didn't know that person had gone through something similar. And so when you start to see a collective of people stepping out of their comfort zone, you then maybe have the bravery to also step out. And maybe you never thought about stepping out and saying, this is what happened to me. Or maybe you're not even willing to say what happened to you, but to just, figuratively raise your hand and say, yep, I've been there, is such a powerful thing. And it can mean so much for someone that's survived something.
I think one of the most sort of interesting things that came out of the Me Too hashtag is that it felt very of the moment, mm-hmm. and that it felt like it sprang up from the news that we were seeing and women wanting to sort of pull together and call to action. I thought it was really interesting to find out that it actually wasn't something that was brand new, that the actual Me Too as a movement started 10 years ago. A woman named Tarana Burke had started this as a part of an organization that she started. And I think it was one of those things where, as I learned her story and I learned that she had done this, that it was, for me, it was like, this is amazing that this woman had started this. Mm-hmm. And then it was like equally heartbreaking that like, this is 10 years old. Right. It's been going on, that she's actually been sort of beating the drum for this and we didn't know mm-hmm. for 10 full years. And then it kind of made it even more, at least I find myself swinging back and forth between being really glad that it's out there now, but being really sad that as I was seeing the stories and as I was hearing the stories, that this is not a new concept, that the idea of, women and girls being put in vulnerable situations has happened again and again from generation to generation, that it's still happening right now, that it's something I have to worry about, not for myself, but for my girls. And, and for everybody that comes after us too, that I guess I found myself really sort of getting overwhelmed by the emotional aspect of what was happening. I'm almost not even sure how to acknowledge. I know, I guess me as an individual, I feel like I didn't have the same experience as some other people, but I did feel like there was a collective sort of emotional upheaval that kind of happened at the same time. Can we talk a little bit about sort of what we kind of saw as an upheaval?
The one thing that pops up into my head when we're talking about that is just the simple functionality of our brains. So when we're forced to either think about someone that we care about and their trauma, or trauma that we've experienced, or even just seeing the hashtag #MeToo and knowing what it stands for and knowing that it's standing for trauma, if you're seeing that on repeat, your brain is automatically going to shift into what we call like a reptile brain. It's sort of a part of our brain right at the base of our brain where the cord connects, and we call it the reptile brain because it's fight or flight. It starts to elicit feelings inside of your body that you want to attack something or fight for your life or get aggressive, even if it's not something that directly happened to you. But if you care about someone, or you're seeing a feeling that's elicited, not just even in our community, but nationwide, statewide, nationwide, globally, of things that we know have been happening for, eons, for as long as humans have been on the earth. People that are seen as weaker get preyed upon. And so going back to that whole concept of, we have this reptile brain that is causing us to have these feelings of what is going on and how am I going to protect myself?
Well, I think you made a really great point when you said it's happening globally. I mean, the Me Too hashtag has already been shared in over 85 countries, since it's sort of taken off on Twitter and in other places. When you talk about sort of the emotional piece of this and the emotional reaction to it, what do you, I guess from your experience as a therapist, what are some of the sort of signs you see when someone is sort of just processing things like that for the first time emotionally?
There's no set way to say this is what it looks like, but some of the things that pop up into my head is maybe you're more retrospective than usual. Like you're going throughout your day in a more quieter way. You're in your head more. You might find yourself crying for maybe an unknown reason. You might not even get it. I think a huge one is you'll start to sense anxiety in yourself. You'll start feeling like you're having a heart reaction. Like some people will say, I think I was having a heart attack. I just have these horrible chest pains, or they'll sweat, that kind of thing. When it starts to be a problem is when it impacts your day-to-day life. So if you have that initial reaction, but it kind of goes away, that's of course a struggle. But when it's a daily thing and it's causing you to maybe not have healthy relationships or to interact different in your relationships, then it's like, oh man, this is something I need to talk about. I need to process this because it's really deep down. I call that the deep hurt. When the deep hurt is alive and well, so alive and well that you're wearing it for people. Oh, that's heavy.
Well, talk a little bit more about that idea of wearing it for people, because from what I understand, you're very much saying that there's an emotional response, but there can also be really a physical response to this.
Absolutely. I think, mental health is, I think, starting to really gain a lot of credibility in our culture. I think it should always have had credibility, but unfortunately, I think now it's something that's becoming more accepted. But people will sometimes identify, oh, I think I'm having a heart attack, or I'm feeling faint. They'll connect it to a physical response instead of like, well, geez, I've actually been feeling like stress or sweaty palms or that kind of thing this whole time. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely makes sense to me, because I think I've sort of used myself as an example that I spent a lot of time sort of feeling like, now that I know this, now that I know all of these people have gone through this and that I had my own experiences with it, and there was this sort of collective, I felt like I was responsible as a woman and as a feminist and, as a supporter to sort of understand. And the way I tried to understand was sort of to immerse myself. And I think as women, we do that. I think
Absolutely.
we charge in and we want to help and we want to empathize, not just sympathize. We want to empathize and feel your pain and walk through it with you and be supportive of you. And I think we have a habit of empathizing to the point of, I feel like it's like you're trying to immerse yourself in the water of it, and then you wind up sort of drowning in it.
Yeah.
And I know I've spent a lot of time with this information and on social media, not just sort of seeing how many hashtags are out there, but taking the time to read the stories and read, that this is what happened to this person, and reading the articles that are coming out, because we're about 3 weeks into the news cycle on this, and there are still stories actively coming out day to day, and there are more people stepping forward and more women telling their stories and more women coming forward to accuse Weinstein and others of atrocious behavior. And I don't always know where the line is between I'm having these feelings and I want to support you, and I feel like to support you I should be knowledgeable, where you go from I got a good base, I understand, to I have now absorbed hundreds of words and thousands of words of some other person's trauma, and now I don't really know how to shed it.
Right. You soaked up like residual trauma.
Yeah.
And so my thought is then it is real for you then. It maybe wasn't your direct story, but as somebody that has lived a day in a life, I mean, I would imagine have had some hurt somewhere at some point in some way, shape, or form. So you're absorbing someone else's trauma, but because you've had pain, absorbing that trauma then goes right back into where your pain center is. It hits your deep hurt. And so even if it's not your story, if you're having feelings, then it's real and it can be treated the exact same way. I mean, the DSM, our big Bible, if you will, of mental health diagnoses, they changed PTSD criteria a couple years back to say that you didn't necessarily have to be the one that experienced the trauma, but maybe somebody close to you did. And so you took that trauma into yourself, that makes
which
sense.
Sounds completely like something that as a woman, we
absolutely,
because we're sort of geared to and built toward and socialized to do that. I think it makes it very easy for us to absorb that. You actually that was a sort of a great turning point. Let's talk a little bit about the terminology, because I think when we talk about these situations and we talk about the kind of things we're seeing in the media right now, we have a tendency to hear certain terms and phrases and immediately say, "Oh, that doesn't apply to me." And I know I very much did that when the hashtag first came out, and I first started to follow it, and I started to sort of dig into the story of it, and I was reading these awful experiences of women who were assaulted, who were harassed, who were coerced, who were put in very, very vulnerable positions. I immediately thought in my head, I mean, I know what I went through I did not enjoy, but I immediately sort of divorced myself from the idea of what I went through wasn't as bad as what somebody else went through. And I think that's something that we do quite often. So when I heard sort of common mental health terms like words like triggered and phrases like PTSD, I just immediately thought those don't apply to me. They don't apply to me. Can we talk a little bit about that? Let's define out for the audience, when we say that someone may be triggered by what we're talking about or triggered by what they've seen, what does that really mean?
I think it's as simple as, does it elicit a feeling inside of you? I mean, if you read a story or another person comes out and it's on the news about so-and-so did this to me, and you have some sort of reaction, whether it's a punch in the gut or it's just even like a quick flashback of something that you've experienced, or it elicits a conversation that keeps you thinking, that's being triggered. If you have a reaction, then you're triggered. So I say that to also say that there are some triggers that are going to be more intense. I mean, again, going back to what I was originally saying is, okay, so you were maybe triggered because you were watching the 10 o'clock news and Weinstein, came out and said, I'm innocent, and that bothered you. And then you're thinking about it. Maybe it causes you to not sleep or not sleep well. And you wake up and those thoughts are still in your head and they carry with you through the day. I mean, to me, that's an more intense trigger. And then where can you go? Who can you talk to? What skills can you use to take care of yourself essentially throughout the day? But there's all different levels of trigger. But I think if you felt something in your life and you hear a tough story and you have a reaction, boom, trigger.
Yeah, to me, that would I guess it makes sense when you're actually looking at it. I think it's very hard in the moment when you're feeling it to recognize that that's where you are and to acknowledge that it's okay, that's where you are, that it's okay that it's happening to you. I think a lot of times, and I know myself personally, I resist the urge to feel it because on one level, that means I have to go back and sort of tread back into something bad that happened to me. But at the same time, I think a lot of times when we define out empathy, we think I'm supposed to feel bad for you, but I'm not supposed to feel bad for myself. Right. It feels selfish to have empathy turn into any kind of self, and I think a lot of times we tend to think of it as self-defeating. Like I don't want to point at myself and say, oh, I hurt too. Right. It feels selfish to do sometimes.
Can I add in on
absolutely
on the context of trigger? For me, in my own experience, being triggered has something strongly to do with remembering a traumatic experience itself. And so I think that, like before I was raped, I definitely heard news or read stories that upset me, that angered me. And rightly so. I think I would be afraid of the person who could receive information that one of their loved ones had been hurt by perhaps someone they knew and not feel anything or remained in this like neutral or centered space. That I think a healthy person has a reaction of anger and grief and empathy and compassion. That those are maybe not pleasant emotions to deal with, but they are healthy ones to have at least some kind of fluctuation emotionally. But for me, a trigger has often meant there's some form of stimulus, usually external, that is some way reminding me of the way that I felt in the moment of being raped. And that's, I think, something that I'm in these situations where I'm reading these stories and there's something about it. And maybe it's even the experience of reading story after story after story and feeling powerless in the context of, is there anything I can do, or hopeless, or feeling scared because we are starting to see just how much sexual violence there is out there. And yet the statistics show 97% of perpetrators walk free, meaning that these people are out here. The sexual offenders that we know are registered in our neighborhoods are just such a slim number of those who have actually committed these forms of crimes.
I think one of the reasons why part of this is so overwhelming is because it very much feels like almost like a domino effect. The Weinstein story came out in short order within a week. Other high-level, folks that worked in Hollywood started being accused and stepping down from positions and being forced to step down from positions. And for like a second, everybody went, oh, that Hollywood, it's terrible. And then the next week, it trickled over to the news media, and it started being, reporters and journalists, people that were highly respected, who were now being put front and center and being forced to step down. Then it took, a turn, and it was people in the culinary world, like luminaries in the culinary world having to step down from companies they had built. And it just seems like every day it's another domino in another industry. I know I had a very overwhelmingly angry response to the idea that it's everywhere. And then you kind of have that moment of, I don't even know how to wrap my brain around it. And I've really struggled in the last few weeks feeling like why am I feeling so, emotional about this? And why am I feeling so sort of tied in knots about this? And I think a lot of women are walking through and feeling that experience.
I feel like, when the Harvey Weinstein news broke, and I think it was a Sunday night where I logged onto Facebook, and it literally felt like all of my female friends were saying Me Too. Like it was, every post in my news feed was Me Too, Me Too. And it was, it brought up so much, but I feel like it was the start of one of my worst weeks. Like I felt in some weird way like there was a really strong sense of solidarity, and I was certainly inspired by the many people who came forward with saying Me Too or telling a part of their story. but it also, Twilight, really, I feel that anger in myself as well. And I just felt like the amount of anger and frustration to recognize the scale of this problem, which is, in many ways what I do with Break the Silence on a daily basis as it is, but to see this level of engagement, to kind of pull back the curtain and see this huge issue that's been silenced for so long was incredibly overwhelming. To think, how could we possibly deal with this as a society?
I think that's very much, I think a lot of people are feeling that, that idea of like, I don't even know where to start to unpack this. The more I learned, the more it was just like, I can't scrub my brain now.
Mm-hmm.
It's just stuck in there now.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then you genuinely don't know what to do. We talked a little bit about the idea of being triggered and what that means. And I think that's really important because a lot of people don't understand that they're having a triggered response, that it's eliciting a particular response. Talk to me a little bit about the idea of what PTSD is and how it applies here.
Well, just from the therapy lens. So essentially, in a nutshell, post-traumatic stress disorder means you experienced a trauma and it was significant enough in your life that it caused you to not function appropriately in quotations, whatever that means. Traditionally, a lot of people relate PTSD to soldiers that are coming back from war, but it can mean many things. Like I said before, it could mean that maybe you witnessed a close friend of yours go through a traumatic event, or maybe you heard about your friend's story and it impacted you so deeply that then it caused you to not function, quote unquote, appropriately. For a lot of people, that looks like having flashbacks to the point that maybe they're afraid to leave their house, or it's hard for them to get to work and function at work in the way that they had previously. It usually means a pretty significant upheaval in anxious feelings day to day, again, causing struggle to function. I see it as a family therapist, somebody that really believes in systems, that it impacts relationships. So maybe you can't look at maybe a man the same way as you used to. Maybe when you come home at night, you don't look at your partner the same way you used to. You can't communicate in the same way. So anytime that something impacts you to the point that you're not functioning is when it's something that's diagnosable. But I think whether you are diagnosed with PTSD or not, you might still be having PTSD-like traits, and that needs to be recognized. Even just listening to experiences and knowing my own experiences here today, I mean, those are bits and pieces of PTSD. Is it diagnosable? I don't know. But it's real, and we have to manage those feelings and get through them, whether that's collectively or individually or in our relationships. But when those things are impacted and you can't get through them, that's when the struggle is real, and you have to look at maybe therapy, or for some people, medication is an answer, or group therapy, that sort of thing to manage the PTSD symptoms.
Let's talk a little bit about the idea of managing what happens. I think is a part of what's been sort of going on. I think one of the places where we've all been struggling is how to manage ourselves with this new set of knowledge that, one, the world we live in is not what we thought it was, and that, two, the world we live in is far worse than we ever imagined it was. Can we talk a little bit about sort of what kind of things we can do to, just sort of initial steps when you're feeling overwhelmed by it, that we can kind of help ourselves get through these situations?
My first reaction is I think that sometimes there's a place to not manage the feelings. And if you're feeling really angry or really sad, to not manage them, let it fly. As a woman myself, I know that I've held things back on purpose for a massive amount of time, and maybe the Me Too campaign or another thing that's happened in the world has caused me to emote those things, and that is the healing, not managing the feelings. So let me say that piece. Then there's, traditional things that you hear about. There's muscle relaxation you can do, yoga, that kind of thing, deep breathing. My favorite deep breathing technique is inhaling on a 4 count, holding it for a 4 count, exhaling on a 4 count, and then waiting for 4 seconds until you do it again. And you do that 4 times, and it will sort of make you lightheaded, and it will cause your brain to stop whatever anxious thought you're feeling. It'll stop that even for a short amount of time. And when that 4 cycle is done, you can look back on that and think, okay, for that 2 minutes or however long it takes you to get through it, I didn't have any of those feelings. And you can consider that a reprieve. Will it last? Probably not. But when you do that and you put that into your day-to-day functioning and you practice it, it's sort of like meditation. You'll get real good at it, and it will give you some relaxation time from whatever is causing the pain and stress. Another thing that I use with clients that have really intense triggers that they get to really dark places, especially when they're alone, is I tell them to go grab ice out of their freezer and hold ice. It's actually from DBT therapy. Mm-hmm. You hold ice in your hand, and what are you going to do? You can only hold ice in your hand for a certain amount of time before you just have to throw it. But your brain for that time is slowing down and only concentrating on ice in your hand. So there's some of these sort of silly tricks. But I also really think that going and finding somebody that you can trust, or if you go out and find somebody that you can trust to talk to, and then you quickly realize, oh, wait a minute, you're not the ally that I thought you were. You can give yourself the permission to step out of that and stop sharing the narrative, the story that you want to talk about that you need to process through.
Talk about that a little bit, because I think what a lot of us are running into, and especially when a news story is like, it sort of has this scope. You learn all this stuff. Everybody's kind of been talking about it. It's really around the water cooler. Somebody comes up to you and they have to talk about it. And you maybe you can't do anymore. You can't take anymore. You've absolutely been triggered by it. You're struggling. I think Sarah, you put it really beautifully that it was a tough week for you because it was a lot on the surface and it brought back a lot of what you went through. And I can't imagine having people, thinking on top of that because they think you're an expert in this sort of area, that you'd be fine to just keep talking about it and to sort of swim and travel in it over and over again. Can't even begin to imagine.
Honestly, I feel like the part where it's the fright, the fear of it comes back where when we start to recognize just how pervasive of a problem this is, and we also know that statistically most people are sexually assaulted by someone they know. So when I see all my Facebook friends saying that they have experienced some form of sexual violence or harassment, that also has to tell me that not only am I surrounded by survivors, but there are people I know who are perpetrators, and I just don't know who they are. And it's not the survivor's job to tell me that. It's the criminal justice system's job to hold these people accountable, which they're not doing if the victim survivor chooses to report. But I think what the overwhelming fear and the trigger for me was that I was reminded that I'm not really that safe in this world, and that it's not very safe to be a woman in a culture where, we're drowning in rape culture and rapists walk free. I think that's a really frightening thing to take on, to recognize that I'm not even safe. I wasn't safe in my own home with the person that I trusted the most at a given point in my life 2 years ago. Not everyone has that experience, but we know from the many people who spoke out that this is an experience that does happen sometimes at home, most often with people you know. When you have the desire to be safe and feel protected, things like Me Too highlight the fact that maybe we haven't found that space yet. And I haven't found that corner yet where I feel like this would never happen to me again.
Knowing that and feeling that, it's already super difficult to even engage in it. And you do such a beautiful job. You do beautiful work engaging in it every day.
Thank you.
And it just kind of makes me Well, as always, it makes me very angry that we don't have, sort of the tools to address this, that we haven't sort of hit on this sort of in the whole. But I can only imagine if you were, if you were very much in the emotion of it, if you were very much triggered by it and you didn't know, like somebody just comes up to you and they're like, I want to, like, can you believe this? But did you hear about this part of the story? Did you hear about this part, where they're telling you like specific details and you just can't handle it. I know me personally, I'm good at exiting a conversation. I'm pretty good at just shutting people down because that's what I get paid to do. But Sarah, can you give us some sort of strategy on how to get out of a conversation that you really don't want to be in, or how to get out of, you phrased it really well when you said if you're looking for somebody that you trust and it turns out over the course of the conversation, they're not the ally you thought they were. Mm-hmm. How do you sort of safely take yourself out of that conversation?
Mm-hmm. I think if I was sitting with a client, I'd coach them through simply saying, wow, you know what? Actually, I can't really talk about this right now. Simple things like that. I think sometimes practicing it out loud. So sitting with someone you do trust, a parent or a sibling or a good friend, and practicing that so that when someone does approach you at the water cooler and you're just cashed out, you can say, you know what, I gotta exit from this conversation. Practicing that is going to be key. I also would say, you know what, if it's too hard for you, I think you get the pass to say, oh, you know what, my phone is vibrating. I got to go take this call.
I love that.
Just make something up to get away, because you don't want to re-traumatize yourself by taking care of someone else at the water cooler, essentially. I say that's a time to just go ahead and utilize that fight or flight in your reptile brain and get out of there. So if you don't have the guts to say, and I'm done here, I'm out, I can't talk about this anymore. Oh, that's my mom calling. She wants to talk about ... Yeah,
XYZ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and get out. I think there's space for that.
I think, I had an experience 2 weeks ago when this was all, when the storm was really hitting strong, and people were reaching out to me asking about, like, should we do this? Should we do that? And it was just personally, like, as a survivor, like, sometimes I feel like doing this work, people forget that I've been raped, which is kind of the driving force behind me doing this, but that there's also days and weeks where I'm just out of commission, where I'm not able to really work effectively because of so much that's happening physically, stress-wise, having, migraines and different stress reactions, and also just emotionally what's going on for me in the context of my relationships. But there was a person who approached me highlighting a local business where people have been assaulted, and were kind of naming a few employees who worked there or who protected people who had been doing this. And it was one of those moments where typically I would be right on the front lines. I'd love to organize, but I just had to say, like, this is such a hard week for me. And I just feel like this is everywhere. Like, it's not just one business. It's not just one workplace. Like, at some point we also have to name what we're capable of just in our own boundaries and say, I can do this sometimes. I can't do this all the time, because there is so much of it.
I actually think that's a perfect transition to something that I wanted to ask you both about. What do you do, or what have you done in terms of practicing self-care in sort of the midst of all of this?
I always say magic bullet for this is my granny. I know that sounds maybe a little cliche or silly, but my granny has always been somebody that has has absolutely saved me in my lifetime. And so that might mean hopping in my little purple car and driving down to Wabasha, Minnesota, and sitting with my granny all day. Maybe, smoking a Misty Light 100 with her on her deck, whatever it takes. But I know that that's my safe space, and it might be hours away, but I'm going to find my way there. And if I can't, then it's a phone call. Even if it's in the middle of the night, I know she's my person that will always answer, will love me unconditionally. And then maybe when I can't see through the fog, she can say, Sarah, you need to go paint something. Sarah, you need to go make a piece of jewelry. You need to go dress up and go out to eat. Like, she knows what's good for me. And sometimes I need somebody to coach me through when I'm really struggling. So that's my magic bullet for self-care, if you will. But I find that anytime you can be mindful, I do a lot of art and body movement in my therapy work. So when you come see me in my office, you're not just going to sit and talk to me. I'm going to put something in your hand, or I'm going to have you get up with me and walk around, or maybe we're going to shoot hoops, or we're going to do something so that whatever we're talking about, the heaviness isn't just in the voices and hearing, but we're moving our body. We're transporting the trauma and moving it around to shake it out of us, essentially. So whenever I'm needing self-care, it's always, okay, how am I going to move my body as well?
Okay.
I feel like relationships has a really key piece in this in terms of caring. And I've definitely felt like I was able, and I have trustworthy relationships that I can call my mom or talk to my partner and feel like they will meet me with validation and compassion and support. So that is just hugely validating when I feel like my trust in the world has shattered to the floor, that there are people that I can call and talk to that help me rebuild that and like put those pieces a little bit back together. That help me feel safe in the world, just knowing that I have a few people who are there. I also agree that there's something somatic, there's something very physiological about trauma that I think some form of body work or movement does have a positive impact. And I think it's just up to the person to choose what feels right for them. That, I think when I was certified to teach yoga many years ago, the idea was like, yoga is good for everybody and everyone should do it. And now, as someone who has done a lot more around trauma and being educated around trauma, I guess I'm here to say that like there's nothing that's great for everybody. And the importance is to just do what feels right for you. One of the things that feels right for me is dancing in my living room. And I just feel like it's something I've done since I was a child. I love to dance. I'm not very good at it, but I truly love it. And there's something that just changes in me when I turn on music that I like and move without feeling like I'm being watched or that I have to perform, or there's something about just physical movement. Totally my choice. I have ownership over my body. I don't feel like it's being judged or looked at. And this whole I get very triggered feeling like an object in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think, when I walk down the street and someone shouts from their car window, it triggers me to that place of being raped, where I'm like, I'm reminded that this is truly is a man's world, and men do things and get away with it all the time, particularly to women and children. And so having that space, having something that's kind of my space that's been reclaimed, my body that I feel like is my body, that I can move it how I want to, I can stop when I want to. Those are important things for me.
Absolutely. I want to make sure that we sort of close this particular part of our discussion, understanding that one, it's okay that we've had all of these feelings and things that have come out of this, that even though it feels overwhelming, and then we've all sort of had our struggles with this in the last few weeks, that at least from my perspective, I feel good that I've had that struggle, that I feel I'd rather know it than not know it. Because now as I move from sort of being overwhelmed and emotional and empathetic and angry, that now I'm motivated on top of everything else. Now I want to see something change. I want to do something about it. I also want to point out that I'm really glad that in the course of sort of being able to do this work, that there are people out in the world that do the hard work of supporting individuals when they go through this. To know that there are people like Sarah that's a therapist that helps people process what they're feeling and put the pieces back together and move forward. To know that there's someone like Sarah who starts an organization that allows people to take real action and move forward, I think is a very strong indicator that while we know that this entire place is pretty doggone broken, there are lots and lots of good people in the world who can put it back together and help build it up and make it better. We're going to put all of this information, everything that we've talked about today, any resources, including resources that we might not have mentioned on the podcast, in the syllabus. You can go to matriarchdm.com. That is the Matriarch Digital Media website. Go to our blog. We're going to do a complete blog post outlining and detailing this podcast series with resources and a downloadable PDF so that you will have that information at your disposal. Thank you both ladies for participating today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will talk to you soon. Thanks so much for listening.